So 2019, in more than one way, represented the end of an era for the Carolina Panthers. Now, when you headed into that season, it didn't necessarily look like that, even though you had Cam Newton coming back from the injury. You're thinking, okay, this is still a team that could potentially do something. And even once he went down very early on in the year, this is a team that halfway through the season, with Kyle Allen, for God's sakes, as their starting quarterback, was sitting at 5-3. So, when you talk about the Panthers, you talk about the first half of the season, and you talk about what happened in the second half. It's easy to forget, and maybe a lot of it was smoke and mirrors. A lot of it was riding the fantastic, damn near once in a generation type of season that Christian McCaffrey, Run CMC, had at the running back position. But this was a team that was 5-3 halfway through the year. This is a team that you could have potentially argued, had a legit chance at making the playoffs, even in spite of who they had playing quarterback and some of the other challenges that they had. And if this team would have made the playoffs, you'd been talking about Ron Rivera potentially as a significantly serious Coach of the Year candidate. Unfortunately, after that 5-3 start, it just fell apart, which wasn't the first time in the past couple of years that the Panthers got off to a really good start, and then the wheels fell off in the second half of the year. And boy, did they ever hear. I mean, it got so bad to the point where Ron Rivera was let go before the season even ended. You think about a guy like that, this is a guy that had been there for a long time. I mean, a long time. What are we talking about here? 9 seasons? So you're talking about a guy, head coach for almost a decade, with the quarterback that had been the face of the franchise for almost a decade. 2019 certainly is not the way I'm sure Panthers fans would have envisioned wanting their season to end. But more than that, represented a real crossroads at this moment in time in this Panthers organization history. So as I mentioned, Ron Rivera was shown the door, and in comes Matt Rhule from Baylor, and he's going to sit there and be the guy to turn everything all around. Guess it remains to be seen, but this is a guy that has a documented history, at least at the college level, of coming in and relatively quickly turning around programs. And they made a sizable, significant commitment to him. I will at least give Carolina this. They clearly felt he was their guy, and not only did they feel he was their guy, they made a strong, sizable, significant commitment to him to say that this is the path and direction that we are going down. And honestly, credit to Matt Rhule as well, because I'm sure he was able to somewhat successfully leverage that. I'm here at college, I'm making a good amount of money. I could continue to make a lot of money and probably get even more money going forward. So I have some of the leverage here. And to be fair to him, he absolutely did. And he exercised that leverage to get a nice payday from the Panthers organization. That wasn't the only big change, obviously. Greg Olson's gone. He signed with the Seattle Seahawks. Luke Kuechly retires. This is a guy coming out of that 2012 draft that had been the linchpin, the focal point, the foundation piece, the building block, the quarterback, if you will, of that defense. Similar to how Cam Newton was the quarterback of that team, that offense. Their first round pick, the number 1 overall pick in 2011. And it's crazy to think about it now. 2 guys that throughout this previous decade you had associated with Carolina Panthers football. The quarterback of the offense, the quarterback of the defense, both gone. Luke Kuechly retires, which was maybe a bit of a surprise, but maybe not. And then Cam Newton ultimately was shown the door. This is an organization. You look at somebody like a Steve Smith. There's a recent trend here of some of these breakups don't always go the best. But the reality is unfortunately it was time. And that might be a tough pill to swallow for a lot of Panthers fans. But you're bringing in a new coach. Would a new coach really want to be saddled with a 30-plus-year-old Cam Newton coming off of some injuries? That was the quarterback from a now failed regime. That's a really bad situation to bring a new coach into. That's a really bad situation to put Cam into. So even Cam going to New England, if he plays well there, great, good for him. I guarantee he's going to play better there, whatever he does, than what he would have done in Carolina. And I know it's tough, or I can imagine it's tough. I don't know what it's like to have a real quarterback. The Panthers, they had a real quarterback for several years. And I'm sure for Panthers fans, it sucks. It's tough. It's a bit of an adjustment, but maybe you've come to the reality of, it was time for a change for all parties involved, and it certainly was. And they certainly made a lot of changes in the offseason in terms of who they brought into the fold. They did lose some of their top edge rushers, notably Mario Addison and Bruce Irvin, but they signed Teddy Bridgewater to replace Cam Newton, at least in the short term. It doesn't necessarily preclude them next year from taking a young quarterback in the first round of the draft, but it meant that they didn't need to take one, at least in their eyes and estimation, in the 2020 draft. Signed other guys in free agency. They were actually pretty active there. Robbie Anderson, Tahir Whitehead, John Miller, Stephen Weatherly, Justin Burris. So they spent a lot and spent quite a bit still on the defensive side of the ball, made the trade for Russell Okung, thinking that he was going to bring them something better on that offensive line, especially at left tackle, more than a Trey Turner would. And then what was really interesting to me about what the Panthers did here, and I've spent some time actually trying to think about this because I thought it was kind of weird come the draft that in an offensive-dominated, offensive-driven league, that Matt Rhule comes in and his entire first draft is dedicated and devoted to the defensive side of the ball. Like, that felt odd to me. That felt really strange. So you lose your former Pro Bowl tight end, you lose your former MVP quarterback, you have questions other places on the offense, and yet you invest every single pick on the defensive side of the ball after spending somewhat heavily on the defensive side of the ball in the free agent market. I guess I could look at it like this, is that they're looking at it and they say, right now we've invested quite a bit of money in Teddy Bridgewater, and if he works out and if he is that dude and you don't have to draft a quarterback, now you could sit there and say, well, you've got a quarterback that you're paying a decent contract to, especially if he becomes a legit starter for them, but not something that breaks the bank. All the while, you've surrounded him with a young defense that can help you manage the salary cap the next couple of years, allowing you to make one or two maybe big splash moves if you feel the need to do so. So I get it now. Like I don't know that I totally agree with it. I don't totally know that I'm aligned with the philosophy or the approach. And maybe you could just say, well, that's the way the draft board kind of fell, best player available, so be it. And admittedly to me, it's really hard to pass on a guy like Derek Brown or Gross Matos. Like, these were guys that were good talents, great talents at the position they were drafting them at, and they certainly filled positions of need. It's just nobody on offense at all. Ugh. So, a lot of times when you get a new coaching regime, quarterback change, or especially at least the coaching regime change, I don't know for Carolina if the quarterback change is necessarily viewed with a lot of optimism, but there's reason for optimism. And I think you got to look at it and say, based off of what happened in 2019, Teddy Bridgewater is a sizable, significant upgrade over Kyle Allen. So if this team went 8-8, if they went what they did and what they go 5-11, if they went 5-3 halfway through the season with Kyle Allen as their starting quarterback, now you put a better guy in there, maybe they win a few more of those games. Perhaps. They still have Christian McCaffrey. While it probably is unrealistic to expect them to have that kind of once-in-a-generation type of season again in 2020, he's still a dude. Like, he's a dude and a three-down, multi-purpose, factor-back, difference-maker type of dude that any offense in the National Football League would love to have, even if that means you're now paying him elite running back money. When you look at the passing game, and you talk about you bring in Robbie Anderson, so here's a speed threat to go opposite of DJ Moore, another kind of speed threat. You've got Run CMC coming out of the backfield. And you do have some weapons for Teddy Bridgewater to work with in the passing game. They might not be the biggest names, they might not be the sexiest names, but you can like the potential of what they have, some of the skill that they have in terms of pass catchers. And then I look at the defensive line potential. And you're talking about last year's first-round pick, Brian Burns. You talk about this year's first-round pick, Derek Brown. Now you add a Gross Matos as well, second-round pick. Adding them into the mix with Kawan Shore, all of a sudden you're talking about a defensive line foundationally that could really develop into something nice. I don't know that we will fully necessarily see that in 2020, but we could. We could certainly see those flashes. And I thought Burns had a really good rookie season for the Panthers. I'm excited to see what he does in year number 2. So the defensive line potential here, I certainly think the needle is pointing up and pointing up significantly. In terms of my reasons for concern, looking at that offensive line, how well are they going to be able to protect for Teddy Bridgewater? How much does Okung have left in the tank? They did lose their top 2 pass rushers from last year in Addison and Irvin. So you look at them and you say, okay, now Brian Burns has to step up and take that next step. You're putting Gross Matos potentially in a situation where, along with Weatherly, they have to be able to provide some complementary rush. You need Kawan Short to have a big year. So I do have some concerns about the trenches. And typically, as a general rule, that's not a great formula for success if you have questions in the trenches on both sides of the ball. But, that doesn't automatically mean that they won't play well on those units, or at least one of those units. I look at the back end of that defense, and I've got some concerns. Linebacker, secondary. You got some youth back there in the secondary. You've now lost the kind of pillar foundation piece in the middle of that defense of Luke Kuechly, and I don't care who it is. Like, that's going to hurt. That's going to have an impact, and a pretty sizable one at that. So even though this team heavily invested on the defensive side of the ball, maybe part of it also was the need and the circumstance that required them to do so. I worry about how the back end of that defense is really going to hold up as the season goes along. Now, I think when I look at 2020 for the Panthers, it's kind of one of these weird years. Like, you've signed Bridgewater, but long term, his contract in and of itself does not necessarily preclude you from keeping him as a backup in 2021 and 2022, or a bridge starter for Bridgewater, as you draft somebody like a Trevor Lawrence or a Justin Fields or a Trey Lance or whoever the top quarterbacks end up being in next year's draft class. It's just kind of one of these weird seasons to me for the Panthers. Like, I don't see enough there to say, hey, this is a team that could go from worst to first to make a surprise playoff run. I don't. I'd like to say that I do, but I don't. I just think this team is probably a year away. I think come next year, they certainly could be a lot more interesting and in a hurry. And there's still that unknown piece to me about Matt Rhule. He's a college head coach transitioning to the NFL. Sometimes this works out tremendously well. A lot of times it does not. So I'm kind of hedging my bets here. I think the Panthers will end up last in the division, although it would not surprise me if they beat somebody out like the Atlanta Falcons. I look at them and I say, 6-10 probably feels right if you're a Panthers fan and you've want to tank for Trevor or job for Justin or lose for Lance. Whoever your chosen quarterback is, probably not the news you want to hear is going 6-10. But I don't think the cupboard is totally bare here, nor do I think they are similar to their old former expansion counterparts in the Jaguars, where it's blatantly obvious they're looking to tank. I don't think you could say that here with the Panthers. It probably wouldn't hurt their feelings if they did. And the good thing about it is, because they've committed to the head coach long term, even if they did have a really crappy 2020, it wouldn't be the end of the world for them. It would just potentially put them in the position to accelerate the rebuild even more. But I think this is a 6-10 team. We'll play some teams tough and competitive. Hopefully we'll see some improvements out of that defense, but realistically, probably a year away.